Hi, and welcome to Contemporary Art Worldwide. So let's go. Last time we were talking about, well, we talked about a lot of things because as we get closer and closer and closer to our contemporary era, what you'll notice is that the art world really kind of explodes, doesn't it, in terms of what artists are doing. And, if you think about it, since this course began and since talking about the art of the Renaissance, what we really saw in, most of the European art that we have been studying this entire semester is these sort of long trends. Like, in the Renaissance, all of the artists, even though they had their own sort of individual styles, all more or less sort of painted and sculpted using, the same kinds of rules and the same kinds of style and the same kinds of shared sort of interest. And this created styles that would often last decades and sometimes a century. So, even though there was a difference between like Northern European art and Italian, Northern Renaissance art and Italian Renaissance art, there were certainly certain characteristics that we could find in both. And we see this trend through the Baroque, and we saw it through the Rococo. And then as the world started to as technology allowed the world to become a much smaller place, and travel became easier, and a sort of cross-pollination of cultures, sometimes through sort of good events like trade, and sometimes through bad events like war, exploitation, and slavery. Still, what this did is this sort of mixed cultures together. And this created a really a world that is becoming more and more multicultural. But what this also means is that as we get closer and closer to the contemporary era, we don't have sort of one dominant style that dominates this particular period. What we see are maybe smaller trends, but we're going to be looking at artists over the last 40, 50 years who are all over the place. Some artists who are abstract in their approach, some artists who are very realistic in their approach, some artists who work in very traditional media like painting and sculpture, traditional sculpture materials, and then artists who are sort of pushing the boundaries of technology. And incorporating that into their art. So something we'll see in our contemporary period is there's not one dominant style of art. In fact, artists often will switch styles from piece to piece. So it's really hard to pin down a commonality, although there certainly are. So we use the term postmodernism to describe art that comes after, well, the modern period. And you remember, what is modernism is about? Well, modernism is about, it was often about abstraction, right? It was about truth to materials. It was about form following function. But some of the main ideas with a lot of modernist movements was that art isn't so much, it's not important what art is about, but how art was made or how art was constructed. Art becomes more of a design process than it does sort of a way of representing a visible view of the world. But what we see in postmodernism is basically all rules are off. And we saw this in postmodernist architecture, but it's a movement in art, architecture, and criticism responding to modernism with a distrust of grand narratives and questioning the very nature of art by acknowledging the constructed nature of reality and experience. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that artists are going to start using art as a way of exploring identity, of exploring cultures, of exploring the past. The idea is, look, there's nothing new, right? What can art show us that hasn't been shown before, right? If minimalism has sort of reduced art to metal boxes on a wall, or pop artists have said comic books can be art, then where can we go from here, right? What is the next step? And postmodernism says, maybe there isn't a next step. Maybe instead, what I should be doing with my art is looking back and reevaluating and examining how we got here. And maybe reevaluating art that came before. And maybe art that we thought wasn't very good, maybe it is actually very good. Or maybe that people who weren't often allowed to make art, or only in very small numbers were allowed to make art, maybe they were doing some really important things, and maybe they were representing entire segments of society that were completely ignored. Maybe art and everything, culture in general, needs a reevaluation. And so that's what postmodernism really is. It's kind of a reevaluation of everything that came before. And it says, all right, maybe there's nothing new, but we can look at old stuff with fresh eyes and reevaluate it. So there's lots of visual references to past artworks, ideas, or issue. Identity becomes an important theme. As the world gets smaller and sort of national boundaries become more sort of invisible, and as cultures are able to exchange cultures much more easily, I mean, think of the internet, right? Identity becomes a harder thing to grasp. You know, who are you? How do you identify yourself? You know, I think about a statistic I read. This is a few years ago, but I read that there were, you know, I taught a class on the Dust Bowl, and as I was researching it, I read a statistic that as of like 5 years ago, there were more World of Warcraft players than there were farmers. So I thought that was interesting. Now that doesn't mean that some farmers aren't. You know, they're also World of Warcraft players. But I find this fascinating because what it means is that a lot of those sort of rules or a lot of the identifiers that we used to identify ourselves are irrelevant or not around anymore or don't have the importance that they used to. And we now identify ourselves with things that didn't even exist maybe 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, you know, I identify myself as a nerd. And the sort of the concept of a nerd, for instance, didn't even really exist 40 years ago, right? That nerd, that term only sort of came into use popularly in the 1960s and not really in a heavy way until the late 70s and throughout the 80s. So we now identify ourselves into groups that didn't even exist years ago. Okay, interesting stuff, right? So in postmodernism, there is also a feeling that especially in Western European culture, art and culture has been dominated by white men, which is, I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, if you look at the history of art, you know, people of color and women participated in a very, very small way up until really relatively recently, really until within the last 100 years or so. Just because of the way sort of society operated and the fact that, you know, white men controlled a lot of Western culture. But that is now, you know, shifting dramatically. And a lot of people of color and women are now looking back and sort of rediscovering their past and their culture. And I think a good example of this is your textbook. You know, we are now in the 16th edition of your textbook, and you know, when I started taking art classes in the sort of very early 90s, late 80s and early 90s, there were entire chapters that wouldn't include women artists. Like your textbook, Gardner's Art Through the Ages, we did not study Artemisia Gentileschi, if you can even comprehend that, right? Who's considered one of the great artists of the Baroque period. We didn't even look at her stuff because she wasn't really considered important. And so, you know, certainly by reevaluating history, we are, in many ways, people who did not have a voice or a say or a representation in culture are now getting that. Okay. So a lot of this art that we are going to see in this postmodern period is concerned with social issues now. So let's talk about Jean-Michel Basquiat. Jean-Michel Basquiat is the son of a He's half Haitian and he's half Puerto Rican. He grew up in New York primarily, and his work started to become known in the 1980s. He started as a graffiti artist, and of course, graffiti art is in many cases an illegal art form. It's often performed. It's often put illegally on private property, but it is often an art form, associated with the underclasses of society, and it has sort of a stigma about it. But Jean-Michel Basquiat is really important because in many ways he helped legitimize graffiti art. In fact, he originally signed his names Samo, which was a sort of a pun on the name Sambo, which is a story that was often sort of used in a very racist context, and it was very racist in its depiction of sort of African American people. So he sort of took that name as a way of owning it, and changed the B and removed the B and just became Samo. It's also a play on the phrase, same old shit. This is a guy who often had very much a sense of humor in his work, who often sort of mixed his Haitian background, his Puerto Rican background, his sort of African American background, and you can see that here in this work, which sort of pays tribute to some of the great jazz players. We have an image of the trumpet player Dizzy Gillespie. We have an image of the saxophone player Charlie Parker, who is known as the Bird, and also there's a reference here to ornithology, which of course is the study of birds, and it was a name of an album put out by Charlie Parker. So we're seeing, this guy sort of taking these kind of different scraps of culture and sort of putting it together to make this sort of, statement. At the same time, Jean-Michel Basquiat painted in a very sort of crude way that in some ways was very striking and very shocking. He is often considered to be of what was called a neo-expressionist, because like the German expressionist, for him, he wanted to kind of express sort of the angst of modern culture and modern society, and he felt the best way to do it was sort of in this crude, unrefined, quote-unquote, kind of primitive style. And we've talked about that before. Unfortunately, Jean-Michel Basquiat died at the age of 27 of a heroin overdose, and it's really one of the saddest deaths, because he had a potential to be one of the greats, and he had been taken under sort of the wing of several major artists in New York, but most importantly, Andy Warhol was a big fan and really supported Jean-Michel Basquiat's career from a young age. So it is very sad. Here's another Basquiat work. This is called The Nile, of course, with a reference to Egypt, and the idea of Egypt being this great, grand sort of African culture. And we see other references here to sort of African-style masks, images of sort of references to the pharaoh, the beetle, the scarab beetle, which is a symbol of Egypt. With also a list of sort of Egyptian names, with Memphis, of course, being highlighted here. Memphis is interesting because it is not Memphis, of course. Tennessee is a city that is sort of a birth or the co-birth of sort of the American blues, and a really important city in terms of African American culture and history. And Memphis, Egypt, is a very important city in the history of African culture and Egyptian culture. So he's sort of making a connection here. Kerry James Marshall is another African American artist who often chose to depict African American topics and subjects. This is a work called The Style, and I find this fascinating, and you may hopefully get the reference here. There was, of course, a Dutch design group called the Stijl, or the Style, that, if you remember Mondrian, that we saw a few chapters ago. And this is kind of a reference to that, especially in the use of the primary and secondary colors, I think. But we're definitely starting to see artists who were often on the fringes of the art world, artists from minority groups, artists from LGBT groups, or women artists who were often excluded from the art world in the 80s and 90s really start to make a stronger and stronger presence. We can also see that in Lorna Simpson's Stereo Styles, which is and work sort of focusing on African American culture as seen through various hairstyles. KEHINDE WILEY is another African American artist who makes references to the past. And he makes especially references to traditional European art, often combining it with modern-day hip-hop imagery and style. This work on the left is actually a reference to a painting of Napoleon by Eugene Delacroix, but he has here replaced it with this African-American man in sort of mid-2000s kinds of hip-hop gear. You'll notice that the background is this sort of very decorative wallpaper. This is, in a way, a reference to the falseness of art, of all art, right? That in the original there would have been a background of a sky and mountains behind Napoleon, but here we see this very artificial surface emphasizing the flatness of the picture plane. But instead of a modernist who would use sort of flat sort of geometric shapes and stuff, KEHINDE WILEY is using this 18th century Baroque French style decorative pattern. So once again, he's kind of mixing and matching several things. He's sort of taking 19th century French Romantic art, 18th century French Baroque, modern day hip hop, and sort of throwing it all together. KEHINDE WILEY might be a name you know because last year, 2 years ago now, whatever it was, he painted the official portraits of Michelle and Barack Obama, which are now located in the National Gallery. Every president, after they finish up their tenure, they have an official portrait made, which is hung in the National Gallery, and the Obamas chose KEHINDE WILEY to paint theirs. And you can see, I think, this very kind of typical for him, sort of decorative kind of background that doesn't seem to quite conform to the rules of three-dimension. It seems sort of flat, whereas the president seems to be sitting in a three-dimensional space. It's kind of fun. Okay. Faith Ringgold is another African-American artist, and she started working in the 60s and 1970s. And Faith Ringgold often created work that combined materials. So she didn't just work in traditional painting materials, she also used quilting. And this was once again sort of a reference to African American history. And I've talked about this before when we looked at the work of several artists in the Harlem Renaissance, and I talked about sort of the influence of African American story quilts. And we see that explicitly referenced in Faith Ringgold's work, who often sort of examines African American history by using traditional African American arts and crafts as the basis for her work. And in this case, she is combining painting with a fabric quilted border. And we can see that also in this work. Carrie Mae Weems is another African American artist who focused exclusively on African American themes and culture in her work. A lot of artists from this period especially felt that African Americans had been so underrepresented in art throughout the United States for many years. and they had trouble getting their work shown in gallery. They had their trouble often getting their work reviewed. And, you know, this is not just an issue of artists being shut out by an industry that often excluded African Americans, but it also means that African Americans did not get to see a lot of images of African Americans outside of, you know, certain newspapers or magazines or TV channels that were designed specifically for them. But oftentimes in the larger cultural world, especially in the art world, it was often uncommon in sort of the 60s, 70s, and 80s to see African American themes and stories and narratives. And artists like Faith Ringgold, artists like Carrie Mae Weems, artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat really did a lot to sort of change that. Carrie Mae Weems, I find her work interesting. Her work is, in some ways, is very similar to Cindy Sherman's, where what might at first appear to be autobiographical is actually not. Carrie Mae Weems did this whole series called the Kitchen Table series, which was an examination of sort of African American lives as seen around the kitchen table, sort of using that as the focus, because as for so many of us, that is a big focus in all of our homes and where a lot of activity occurs. But Carrie Mae Weems's works don't feature people playing, or they don't feature real people doing real things, but instead these are models or actors that were hired by her to play roles, to portray kinds of everyday events that would be happening in the home. But these aren't actually real sort of biographical scenes from her life, but these are staged. She is, you know, as an artist, she wants to construct a certain narrative, and she wants to tell a story in the same way that a film director wants to tell a story. So she is sort of setting up these little tableaus, these little scenes that are meant to, well, tell stories of sort of everyday life in African American households. This one is one of my favorites, A Woman and Daughter, sort of with makeup, so we can see this kind of cross-generational sort of interaction between a mother and her daughter. Now, to make it even more confusing, Carrie Mae Weems had another series before her Kitchen Table series called Family Pictures and Stories, which were actually family pictures and stories. So the image on the right is a biographical image. It is an actual sort of snapshot of you know, her life and her friends and family and relatives. So the image on the left, the kitchen table, is staged. It is a constructed narrative, where the image on the right is a documentary image. Barbara Kruger is another feminist artist who started working in the 1970s and 1980s. And Barbara Kruger, like the pop artist, sort of took from popular commercial art, advertising especially, and took sort of the bold imagery and the use of text from advertising. And something you've probably noticed with a lot of the artists, with Jean-Michel Basquiat, with Faith Ringgold, and now with Barbara Kruger, and we're going to see this a lot, is artists start to incorporate text into their work. And this is something we really saw happen in a big way in pop art. Because when you have guys like Andy Warhol who are imitating Campbell's soup cans labels, and they're imitating things like Coca-Cola bottles, they're incorporating text, which is a real big part of modern day imagery, right? In advertising, in magazines, on the internet. Oftentimes we don't, we generally see words now, or we see images in context with text, with writing, whereas, you know, older paintings were meant to sort of stand on their own. That didn't mean they didn't incorporate text sometimes, but it wasn't as important. But one of the things you'll see in contemporary art and postmodern art is this use of text. And here we see Barbara Kruger taking on a subject that, well, I think that it's the same subject that Manet took on in Luncheon on the Grass, 120 years before, which is the concept of what is known as the male gaze. Or, in other words, the way men look at women. And Manet, 120 years ago, was basically saying men in art want to look at women as an object of desire. And, he kind of called us out on it. And now we see Barbara Kruger kind of doing the same thing. She's taken a sort of classical style statue, an image of a woman, and she has saying here, your gaze hits the side of my face. So, for her, there's a much more forceful response to this idea of sort of being looked upon and objectified. She says it's like she's being hit, because she's being looked at as an object, or women in general are looked at as objects very often in art, as opposed to as people. The Guerrilla Girls were a group of artists, and they still are, who started working in the 1980s, and they were anonymous. There's been various theories about who some of these Guerrilla Girls are. Notice the pun in their name. A guerrilla, as in, a kind of a warrior, right? People who fight in guerrilla warfare don't fight in traditional ways, but they often fight from sort of hidden positions, and they're highly mobile, and that's sort of the idea behind the Guerrilla Girls, is that they would do these little strikes, but instead of violence, they would do these sort of propaganda bombs, where they would hang posters in the middle of the night, or they would hang up billboards and things like that. And their work dealt exclusively with women's roles, or very often lack of roles, in the art world. And at the time, it was very difficult, even with this growing number of women who were practicing artists, it was still very difficult for women to get into the big galleries and the museums. And there's still a disparity. It's still majority men who often get into the big galleries and the big museums, although that has improved since the 1980s and 90s. But there still is an imbalance. But at this time in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was pretty stark contrast between the number of women who had big shows in galleries and museums, and the number of men. And so this is a poster that was hung up that said, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? With a little bit of statistics here. Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. So once again, this idea that women are allowed in art, but only as a model, only as an object to be painted, but not as a painter or an artist, right? And so the Guerrilla Girls often would post these posters with sort of factual information, but they often did it in a very humorous way. Like here we have, Ong's Grand Odalisque with a gorilla mask, and that was the symbol of the Guerrilla Girls. Of course, there was a pun on the word gorilla as in the fighter, but also gorilla as in the animal, and so they often played that pun up. But once again, you can see how in postmodernism, we've taken something that is familiar and has come before. In this case, the very famous Odalisque by Ong, and it's been sort of remixed, right? It's been reappropriated into something else. The meaning of it has been reevaluated and changed. So the Grand Odalisque is no longer just an image to titillate a male audience looking at it, but now it is used as, in many ways, kind of as a weapon. And then here's another one. Advantages of being a woman artist: working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs. So it kind of goes on and on. A lot of their, the Guerrilla Girls art had a biting sense of humor, but a sense of humor nonetheless. It was amusing as well as it was informative. Robert Mapplethorpe is a photographer who caused extreme controversy because he received an NEA grant. NEA is National Endowment of the Arts. But the work that he produced with this grant, which is given by the U.S. government to artists, was often very controversial in a very sexual way. And so this stirred controversy, and a lot of people thought that his art was, some people called it pornographic, and it should not be shown because it often reflected ideas and concepts that some people found offensive or immoral. Robert Mapplethorpe was gay, and a lot of his work dealt with images of gay sexuality. A lot of his art is very explicit in its depictions of sexuality, and nothing I'm going to show here. If it's something that you are interested in seeing, it's very explicit. I'm warning you now. Don't say I didn't blame you, or don't say I didn't warn you. So, that being said, Mapplethorpe's work caused a tremendous amount of controversy. He unfortunately died of AIDS during the huge AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, which is still one of the largest pandemics of the modern era. But Mapplethorpe's work brings up a very interesting point, and this is also discussed further in your book. If an artist receives money, an endowment from the government, or any other sort of public source of funds, do they have an obligation to make art that is not offensive? And then you also have to ask yourself, what is offensive? Some people would say that images of sexuality or sexual acts are not inherently offensive because it's something that, well, everybody is aware of and more than likely engages in. Is it offensive? Other people would say yes. And it is not inappropriate for a kind of public viewing funded by public money. And so you can certainly see why there was a debate of his work. But Robert Mapplethorpe was one of the first major artists to deal explicitly with homosexual themes in his art, and to deal with images related explicitly to, gay men's culture. And for that, he's very important, sort of in the history of art. But he did cause a lot of controversy. And and I gotta say, from a personal standpoint, I am very much anti-censorship, certainly, and I believe artists should express themselves. I do feel that maybe, though, if there is public money involved, one should consider the source of that money and the audience for those works. But at the same time, I understand why artists of this era often push things to extremes, because so many of these artists from groups that were marginalized, LGBT groups, African American groups, whatever it was, often felt they didn't have a voice. And sometimes when you don't feel like you have a voice, the only way you can get heard is by screaming and drawing attention. And that's what, I think some of this art of the 70s and 80s is very much about. It is people who are kind of fed up with being ignored, and they're doing their best to be heard. Just my take. David Wojnarowicz is another artist who dealt explicitly with gay culture, and his work, When I Put My Hands on Your Body, specifically focuses on the AIDS epidemic, which in the 1980s and 1990s killed millions and millions of people. But because at the time homosexuality in this society was, for many people, very, very taboo, it was oftentimes underreported, and in many ways the government was slow to respond to the millions of people who were dying of this disease. And as a person who grew up during this time, and as a person who actually lost some friends to HIV and AIDS, it was a devastating time in American history because in so many ways these casualties were ignored, or at the very worst, sometimes they were even mocked and made fun of. But it was millions and millions of people who were killed during this epidemic, and this is a work that addresses that. The loss of someone who you love, in this case to AIDS and HIV. Notice once again the combination of words and text, which is a very common sort of trope in postmodernist art. SHAZIA Sikandar is an artist from Pakistan who, like many postmodernists, takes very ancient art forms, very old art forms, and modernizes them and updates it. In this case, she takes book illustration, or the more appropriate word is illumination. And in both the European Middle Ages and in the early Islamic world, books were hand-written and hand-painted. And there was a very long tradition, thousands-year-old traditions of what is called book illumination, where artists will hand paint and hand scribe books. And there's a very long tradition in the Middle East, in Pakistan, and then also further east in Iran, or what was once Persia, which influenced a lot of the art of the Middle East. And so SHAZIA Sikandar trained in this very old technique of hand illuminating these books. And we use the term illuminate because oftentimes gold and silver leaf, actual gold and silver pieces were used in these books, and they reflected light. So we say illuminate in manuscripts. But they would hand illuminate these books, and these pages are very tiny. I mean, you're looking at something that is only 10 by 8 inches, but some of her images pack a ton of detail. But she uses sort of traditional sort of book illustration combined with modern day themes and stories from her life and her own experiences as a modern woman. So she sort of, once again, is sort of using the past and referencing the past to help understand and explore the present. And I wonder if you can hear my cat meowing in the background. Shirin Nishat is another artist who deals with sort of the past and the present coming together. This is an artist from Iran who lived through the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s, which saw the Iranian government, which was fairly open at the time, turn into a rather sort of strict government that adhered very closely in a very fundamentalist sort of ways to Islamic law. And this meant that women who had considerable freedom, literally sort of overnight, that freedom was taken away. And Shirin Nishat was actually living abroad, and when she moved back to Iran, the culture was very different. And so a lot of her work deals with a feeling for her, a loss of freedom as a woman, as a person who once experienced, fairly equal rights, and now does not feel like she has those anymore. And her work often incorporates traditional art forms, body art, henna, for example, the writing on the body, which is a very traditional art form combined with sort of modern day imagery. She not only is a photographer, but she also makes films, and her films often deal with the differences of men in modern Iranian society and women in modern Iranian society. And because of the clothing requirements sometimes that women must wear, she personally feels isolated from society, and she often uses contrasting images between men in society and women in modern Iranian society. Edward Burtynsky is an artist who, like many modern artists, is interested in environmental concerns. And so we see here a photograph of a scrap metal, sort of, drawing our attention to the wastefulness of modern society. But postmodernism often tackles issues. It often tackles problems with society, whether it is social problems, whether it is inequalities, or whether it is, things like pollution. Krzysztof WODICZko is an artist who took pictures of homeless people and then projected those onto public monuments as a way of drawing our attention to the homelessness problem in this country. Fernando Botero is an artist who deals explicitly with political situations and controversies. This is a work called Abu Ghraib, of course, which is a reference to the prisoner of war, or the facility that where prisoner of wars from the United States-Iraqi conflict have been kept. And a number of years ago now, there were accusations of cruelty and mishandling of prisoners, and even indications that there were torture. The torture was being practiced by the United States on the inmates there, and there was a series of photographs that were released that were really quite unnerving. I don't know if you guys remember, but this is Fernando Botero taking on what he sees as the cruelty of the incarceration practices that occurred at Abu Ghraib. So a lot of the art of this period is explicitly political, but of course, hopefully you guys realize now that art has always been political. All the way back. Really since the beginning of time, but since the beginning of this class, we have seen art with political messages, and oftentimes made in protest. And we especially saw that in the Romantic era with works by people like Goya, Francisco de Goya, who in many ways is kind of a spiritual godfather to Botero. Willie Bester is a South African artist whose work often deals with the political struggles of his nation. Of course, up until the 1990s, South Africa was a country that practiced what they called apartheid, which was a separation of the races. And there were many people who, for many, many years, who fought long and hard for the ending of this state policy. And one of those was a guy named Stephen Biko, who is honored in this work. Stephen Biko died in the custody of the police, and the two doctors who were responsible for him and more than likely helped cause his death were exonerated by the courts. And this eventually led, along with several issues, to the ending of apartheid and a growing equality in South Africa. And so this work explicitly deals with that political situation. Like a lot of, Robert Rauschenberg and some other artists of the last few decades, there is kind of a kitchen sink approach to this artwork. We're not just seeing one medium like painting or drawing or sculpture, but instead we're seeing sort of an approach where real objects that pertain to the situation. In this case, we see shells and casings, we see bullets, we see other kinds of police equipment associated with the practices and the enforcement of apartheid being integrated here into this work. Jenny Saville is an artist who often deals with the age-old subject of the human body, But like Lucian Freud before her, she sort of rejects the stereotypes of traditional art and its depiction of sort of the sort of classic nude as a way of, a way bringing sort of body positivity concepts to her work. In this work called Branded, Jenny Saville is sort of referring to the way the body is often used by corporations, by brands. The sort of stereotypical model bodies that we often see are used to sell clothes and become sort of the standard of beauty. And if you are, she's playing here with the term branded, right? Where, the idea that, bodies are used to sell brands of clothing, but also if you don't conform to those stereotypes, you are branded as somebody who is considered not meeting those standards of beauty. And she uses her body very often in her own art as a way of sort of confronting sort of our stereotypes of what a beautiful body, what defines a beautiful body. Kiki Smith is another artist that deals with the human body. She also incorporates a lot of sort of knowledge of the history of art into her work. This is she often makes works with very strange materials. In this case, she uses beeswax. Now, she uses beeswax first of all as a reference to a technique of making sculpture called the lost wax technique, which is a technique that dates all the way back, to the early civilization. The ancient Greeks, for example, used wax in their metal casting sculptures. But wax is traditionally a material that is used in the process, but it is ultimately discarded. But Kiki Smith, who likes to sort of turn things on their head, uses the wax as the main material. And by using something fragile and organic, she is kind of referring to the fragile organic qualities of the human body. She often uses very sort of quote-unquote normal types of bodies in her work. And once again, in kind of a challenge against the tradition that all models in art, have to look like supermodels. She's kind of fighting against that stereotype. Keith Haring was an artist very popular in the 1980s who sort of was, in some ways, a modern Matisse, who often used big, flat, colorful, kind of cutout sorts of shapes, but also drew from African influences and things like that in his art, and often reference sort of a kind of a fun sort of graffiti style. His work has become quite popular, and you see it on greeting cards and T-shirts and things like that. So it's not all serious, heavy-duty stuff. Sometimes we can still have some fun with art, and Keith Haring is proof of that. Jeff Koons is another artist very much in the pop art tradition who sort of uses the images of everyday popular culture in a way that is meant to be humorous. Jeff Koons's art is often considered to be outrageous because it is often sells for a lot of money, and his art often depicts very silly things like Michael Jackson and his pet monkey, or the Pink Panther and a mermaid. It is often made up of sort of the ridiculous, cheesier parts of pop culture, and yet he makes things often on a very large scale using very expensive materials. And in a way, he's sort of saying, this stuff that so many people think is disposable is actually an important part of our culture. Mark Tansey is another artist who often references the past. In this case, the history of art itself is so much modern art, or I should say, postmodern art does. Mark Tansey's father was actually one of the, at one point, an editor for your textbook, Garner's Art Through the Ages. So he grew up with the history of art in his household. But I love here, this is called the Short History of Modernist Painting. And this is, if you think about it, about the way artists started to think about the picture plane and sort of the flatness of the picture plane. So here we see like early modernism with like cubism, right? And we see that they're figuring out, oh, you know, we used to think that art was sort of like a window. Painting was a window into the world, but it's actually flat. And you can see the woman, you know, the hose, the water is stopped by the flatness of the glass. It is not actually a view into another world. It's simply just a flat thing. And then we start to see artists sort of expressing themselves violently and physically against that picture plane. In other words, this is like abstract expressionism and Jackson Pollock and those artists who would physically assault the canvas. And then we realize that art can be a reflection of who we are. And so in this final image, we see a chicken looking into this mirror, seeing itself, and understanding that, you know, one can interpret, one can learn about oneself through the image. And so this is sort of a reference to postmodern art, which is about reevaluating images of ourselves in art. Kind of interesting, kind of fun. Damien Hirst is another major artist. He's a British artist. He belonged to a group of artists called the Young British Artists, or otherwise known as the YBA, who were active, and still active, beginning in the 1980s. Their work was often very brash. It was influenced by punk rock music, and it was intentionally wanting to shake up the art world. It was often very, very over the top. Damien Hirst very famously, one of his works was an actual shark cut into 3 pieces and stored in formaldehyde. Their work was often intentionally shocking. This is a work called Hydra and Kali. This is Damien Hirst often draws from, like many postmodernists, draws from the history of art. And in this case here, we can see him combining imagery both from Greek mythology and Hindu mythology. Anselm Kiefer is a German artist who is influenced heavily by the Holocaust and World War II. He is an artist working in a modern expressionist tradition, often using sort of dull colors and thickly applied paint to create a sort of a feeling of dis-ease and sort of sadness, evoking the sort of horrors of a post-Holocaust world. So what I'm hoping that you guys are getting out of this so far is that in the postmodernist era, really kind of all bets are off, right? There's anything and everything is acceptable. We've seen work that references graffiti art. We've seen work that references German expressionism. We see work that is realist. We see, you know, all of these different kinds of art. So it's not about one movement or one style anymore, but instead it's about artists using the best way and the best style and the best materials and the best methods to express their point. That is what's more important than style. We also see in the postmodern period a sort of growing influence of installations. And we've talked about installations before. Installations are artworks that take up and transform an entire space. And an installation can be, you know, converting a space or a room or a gallery into a kind of fictional environment. It could be sort of covering the entire room with different kinds of art. It can be a lot of different things. The word installation is very loose. This is a Japanese artist, Yayoi Kusama, who is known for her large-scale installations, and her artwork is influenced heavily by pattern, which she sort of incorporates into her own life and her own dress. She is a big fan of the polka dot, as you can see with this work here. But her work often transforms entire spaces, creating environments for people to sort of walk in and interact with. Her art is very popular these days. In fact, last year there was a showing of her work at the Dallas Museum of Art. That was very fantastic. I'm sorry you guys missed it. But she creates these large interactive spaces, and they're awesome to take selfies in or to take photographs of you and your friends in, because her work sort of provides not just something to look at, but really an entire experience. She's an incredibly influential artist these days, and a lot of art deals with, instead of just just showing a picture of something, they transform an entire space and create an environment that the viewer can become part of. And her work is incredibly influential in that regards. We also see throughout the 1970s and 80s and 90s and up to today, the growing interest in video art and technology in art. And of course, this just makes sense, right? If with the rise of the videotape in the 1970s and 1980s, and then the rise of home computers in the 80s, 90s, and up through today, we see a lot of artists using these materials, oftentimes to humorous effect, oftentimes to sometimes make fun of or bring forth problems that are inherent in a society that is so dependent on technology. And this is a work by an artist named Adrian Piper, whose work is often about the distance that technology can create. And this is something that we are experiencing right now, because this video, for those of you from the future, this was recorded during the social distancing, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, we were forced, and some of you who are experiencing this right now in the semester, this, we are forced to take our classes online, whether that is something you signed up for or not. And some of you are experiencing this distance of technology. But what Adrian Piper here has done is kind of, taken a typical situation a lot of you will encounter in your professional lives, a meeting. But notice how the table is overturned, creating a barrier between the woman who is leading the meeting on the monitor and the people in the chair. And so she's commenting here, making the sort of observation that, these technologies that in some ways bring us closer together also separate us. And I find that fascinating as a person who you are watching on probably a device, maybe a computer, but more likely a phone or a tablet. And I am, I'm not even here, right? I'm a recording of me. I am not even the real me. And so now their education, which used to be exclusively a face-to-face endeavor, is now can be created with technology. But even though that's awesome and convenient, and we wouldn't be able to have this class in this situation without it, at the same time, now there is a barrier between myself, the instructor, and you, the student. Hey, there's a barrier, let me out. Yeah. I would feel bad for my wife too. She has to live with this. But, here's Adrian Piper in 1988, so 32 years ago, addressing these issues back then, which I find fascinating, that technology can bring us together, at the same time create new kinds of barriers in between us. Bill Viola is a video artist, but he uses video in a way almost like a painter would. In fact, he often refers to his videos as sort of video paintings. He wants to create a very almost traditional experience of going to a museum or a gallery and seeing images on the wall, except his images move. But his paintings, so his videos are they're like slowly moving paintings. Most of his videos are slowed down. A lot of his paintings deal with themes of spirituality. He often draws from various religions. For example, this image called The Raft, which also refers to Jericho's The Raft of the Medusa, which you guys know, also refers to the Great Flood. a story that is told not only in the Bible, but is, there are great flood stories in almost every major world religion and mythology. And so he takes these concepts and he sort of brings them into the modern day. But like this work called The Raft is about the idea that a flood not only destroys, but it also purifies and creates new life ultimately. And, the flood or the image of water itself can represent the idea of cleansing. We can think of in Christianity baptism. We can think of in other religions the concept of a water used to purify, both physically purify and clean, and spiritually purify and clean. And he kind of plays with these concepts, but he makes these sort of living paintings, often in super slow motion, to create this sort of dramatic effect, often using sound effects. But his work, as the one in your book, The Crossing, often focuses on spiritual themes, and he uses imagery that is found in almost every world religion. Floods, fires, those kinds of things that represent concepts of purification and spiritual change. If you've never seen a Bill Viola, I highly recommend it. But artists in general in the 90s really started to experiment with this new form of video. And oftentimes they would use projection, like Tony Orsler here, who often would project record people's faces and then project them on other objects to bring them to life in a rather unnerving sort of way. We're really starting to push the boundaries of the technology. Jenny Holzer is another artist who deals with technology and mainly with LED displays and text displays, like the kinds of things you would see, on a bank or something like that, a sports scoreboard or things like that. And she uses primarily text in her images. Oftentimes, these texts comment on modern society and often deal with issues of modern life using modern technology to deal with those issues. I mean, some of these artists are like, why should I make a painting about the problems with technology and living in a technological culture? That doesn't seem appropriate. Why shouldn't I use technology as the basis for my art about the problems of technology? Installations can take many, many forms. Tara Donovan is an artist who often uses objects that are mundane, that are common, that are literally disposable. And she does this for several reasons. Like in this work, Untitled from 2003, she uses styrofoam cups. Not only is she sort of commenting here on the ubiquity, the commonness of the styrofoam cup, how it's everywhere, how, probably, many times throughout a week, you might find yourself drinking from a styrofoam cup, but also, of course, referencing to the great amount of waste and trash produced by these. But also, she's looking at this common object in a new way, and something that is literally disposable and we don't even think of. If we were presented with an image where the styrofoam cup could be beautiful, would we think about it in a different way? And so here she creates these sort of amorphous, almost cloud-like forms that look almost beautiful and ethereal and elegant out of something as common and basic and disposable as a styrofoam cup. Once again, postmodernism is about re-evaluation. Andy Goldsworthy is an environmental artist who's very much part of the whole earthwork land art movement that we talked about with Robert Smithson in the last chapter. Andy Goldsworthy is an artist who's very much concerned about the way we treat the environment, and he wants to bring our attention to the environment. And he does this by creating installations or maybe I should call them outstallations, because a lot of his work is outdoors, often in remote places where very many people don't travel. So his artwork mainly exists to the public through photographs. But when Andy Goldsworthy goes out to a location, he doesn't bring any tools with him. Everything he creates is found at the site, and everything that he creates with is found at the site. So no tools. So like these rocks were broken with other rocks. The markings on the rocks were made by scratching them with other rocks. Some of his works are temporary. I mean, they last a matter of seconds before they are destroyed. So really it's only through photography that they are preserved. But he uses only delicate sort of natural materials, leaves, stones, like these icicles here. This was created by taking icicles and breaking them off and then heating them with his hands and his breath and melding them back together. There's also the idea here that art can be anywhere. It can be anything. Art is not what something is made with, or even what it's about, but it's about an approach, and the same person can walk past the same rocks on the ground a million times and never see sort of the inherent art inside of them. But Andy Goldsworthy will take those stones and he'll arrange them by their different values from dark to light and create something otherworldly out of something as common as a stone. I think this is fascinating. This is made by stitching leaves together with thorns. Remember, he can't bring glue or anything to stick these together, or adhesives. And so it's just two different colored leaves that he's stitched together using materials that he's found. Christo and Jean-Claude are two artists. Actually, Christo is the artist and Jean-Claude is the sort of business person behind the art, because the work that Christo creates is massive. It's on a massive scale. He often will wrap large objects or even places. And like Andy Goldsworthy, Christo has sort of environmental concerns. He wants to bring our attention to nature. But whereas Andy Goldsworthy does this by sort of reconfiguring natural environments into works of art, Christo does something unique. Christo does something that no other artist in the world does. Every artist shows you something. That's the whole point. They want you to see what they made. Christo covers it up. And so why does he cover up things? Well, Christo covers up things because he understands the human nature. And he understands that if we cover up something, we actually draw more attention to it. You probably weren't even really much paying attention to my face until I covered it. And now that you can't see it, you're curious. What am I doing behind my hands? Am I making faces? Am I crossing my eyes? Am I sticking out my tongue? What am I doing? Am I hiding something from you? Am I trying to be sneaky? What is going on behind here? You see my face all the time. You've sat through hours and hours and hours of lecture, and my face is completely known to you and completely uninteresting. But now you can't not want to see what's behind my hands. It's just like at Christmas, Christo says. Those presents are more interesting wrapped than oftentimes they are unwrapped. Because sometimes when we unwrapped a present, after imagining what was in that package for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we unwrap it and it's like a bunch of old socks and underwear or something, then we don't care. It's no longer interesting. The curiosity that we had was way more interesting than the actual object. And so Christo actually brings our attention to things by hiding them from us. And by hiding them from us, we think about those things more. These are islands off the coast of Miami. We probably, people in Miami probably never even notice these or think about these hardly. And yet, after he covered them up in this pink fabric, all of a sudden people thought about them. Their attention was drawn to them. Pretty cool stuff, right? Christo, his work is on a massive scale. It requires tons of materials, miles and miles and miles, millions of square feet of material. It requires hundreds of people to install this. It requires cops and security. It requires working with local environmental organizations, governments, businesses, because what he does could be very disruptive. Now, Christo and Jean-Claude don't take any grants. They don't want to be beholden to anybody. So they don't take any sort of government money. All of these are self-funded. Well, how do you sell something like this then? How do you make money off of this? Well, they sell the rights to it. So they'll make documentaries or videos. They'll sell postcards and calendars and collectibles. They sell pieces of the material, of the fabrics they use. They sell production drawings and blueprints and things like that. Because some of these works take years, decades even to produce. So Christo generally does the sort of art side. He does the thinking and the planning and the sort of engineering side of things. And Jean-Claude deals with getting the ordinances and the permits and all those sorts of things and dealing with local governments and businesses. But generally, these are huge events. Like the gates in Central Park, which consisted of, I can't even remember, 6,000 or something. So giant gates, 16 feet high, some of these, that were threaded all the way through Central Park. And this was a monumental project. Now, generally, their projects only last a matter of weeks, 2 weeks, 14, 15, 16 days is normal for these. You'll also notice that if you look closely, like the gates here aren't embedded in the ground. Christo and Jean-Claude want to leave the environments better than they found them, so they typically create works that can be easily removed and taken down. But also, in their works, they bring people together. A lot of people volunteer to help with Christo and Jean-Claude's works because they want to be part of something bigger than them. So, there's this idea here of community in art, that art isn't something that the artist does and then people look at. But Christo and Jean-Claude say art can be something that can be created by the community, can bring people together. People can come out and volunteer and be part of this and have a stake in this and have, participate in this art. It's not just an artist over here and a viewer over here, not really quite working together or understanding or communicating or connecting, but instead it's an actual communication. It's a process, right? Cool stuff. I like to call Christo the world's biggest rapper because he raps things. Like the Reichstag. The Reichstag is the capital of Germany, and what's funny is whenever Christo does a big event like this, a big rapping, it actually brings lots of tourists, which I think is ironic because millions and millions and millions of people will go to a place to not see something. Maya Lin is an artist who's most known for the Vietnam Memorial. She is both a sculptor and an architect. And the Vietnam Memorial was an incredibly controversial work when it was first debuted. Some of you might know this as the Vietnam Wall, because it is a large wall consisting, it's 492 feet of black granite, consisting of over 50,000 names of men and women who gave their lives for this country in Vietnam. When Maya Lin created it, she wanted to create a work of art that was not sort of a traditional monument. Because at the time, in 1982, when this was built, the Vietnam War was still very much raw and real to a lot of Americans. And it was an event that really divided this country politically. And a lot of people disagreed with the reasons why we fought that war. And there was a lot of controversy around that war sort of from beginning to end. And so there was a feeling among many people that you couldn't use a traditional monument to sort of praise this as praise the the events of this war, but instead, how do you commemorate men and women who gave their lives for their country for a cause that a lot of people disagreed with? Well, Maya Lin's idea was you de-emphasize the cause and you emphasize the sacrifice. You emphasize the people who gave their lives, because that is noble. Whether you agree or disagree with the war, that doesn't matter. We should honor those who are willing to die for their fellow citizens. And so she created basically a giant grave marker. And notice how this cuts a wedge in a hillside in the same way that the Vietnam War cut a wedge in our country. But this is an amazing piece of art. It's very minimal in its construction. It's just black granite. Black, of course, is the color of funerals and mourning. And when you look at this polished black granite surface, you see not only the 50,000 plus names of the men and women who gave their lives, but you see yourself reflected on those names, with those names superimposed over your face. So once again, like Christo, this is a work of art that literally involves the viewer. We become literally part of the work. And we see those names and we realize we are the reasons those people gave their lives. We are the reason they sacrificed themselves. They're us, their fellow Americans. And then it becomes a deeply moving work, because we understand that we are here because of those people's selflessness. It's a tremendous work that says a lot with very little, with 2 large stone walls and some names. That's basically it. And a lot of people were upset with this work when it was first debuted, because it wasn't a traditional work. It didn't have images of soldiers or the kinds of things we would normally expect to see. On top of that, there were people who were upset that Maya Lin was of Chinese descent. Even though she was born and raised in this country, there were some people who were upset because China was sort of at the heart of the Vietnam conflict. Communist China was supporting the enemy side in the Vietnam War, and so there were a lot of people who were against her ethnicity, which of course is silly. Maya Lin also was an undergraduate when she created this work, and she actually, I believe she got a C from her professor for this work at Princeton, but both she and her, in fact, a lot of people submitted, or a lot of architects submitted work to the Vietnam Memorial, and Maya Lin won the contest, and her professor, who gave her a C, did not. I find that hilarious and ironic. But this is a sculpture near the Vietnam Memorial, because even after the wall was built, there were a lot of people who were still upset with its uniqueness and the fact that it wasn't a traditional monument. So a more traditional monument by Frederick E. Hart called Three Soldiers was put near the Vietnam Monument, or Memorial, I should say, in Washington, D.C. But this work, much more traditional, nobody ever talks about it or remembers it because it doesn't have the impact that the wall did. I want to wrap this all up with very quickly with a very fast look at architecture. A movement that occurs sort of as an offshoot of postmodernist architecture is something called deconstructivism. And deconstructivism literally turns architecture inside out. And we actually saw a little bit of example of this with the Pompidou Center in France. But as we can see in here, Gunter Banicht High Solar Institute, we see a building that almost looks like it's been torn apart and put back together, and we can see sort of the inside of the building kind of on the outside of the building. If postmodernism is sort of a looking back at whatever came before and kind of rearranging the bits and pieces, the parts of the history of art, deconstructivism is very much sort of a postmodernist movement, right? Because it is about taking the history of architecture and literally turning it inside out. But the artist who is, I think, most known for his deconstructivist art and his postmodern architecture is Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is his most famous work is the Guggenheim Bilbao Museo, the museum, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, and it is a work that is often considered to be sort of the textbook postmodernist deconstructivist building. Not only does it look like it's been sort of turned inside out, but the outside does not reflect the inside. Like, you look at this building and you have no idea what the inside will look like. And that's the opposite of a modernist building. Modernism is about being as clear as possible. You know, most modernist architecture looks like boxes. And when you get inside, it looks like you're in the inside of a box. But the Bilbao Museo, the museum here, the inside and the outside don't necessarily match each other. They appear random. Form does not follow function, but instead, Frank Gehry is more interested in creating an almost disorienting experience. He doesn't want you to be able to clearly get to your destination easily. Instead, he wants to create a journey, in a way, from going one place in the museum to another. So not only is the experience of looking at art an experience, but the experience of being in the museum is something that is a strange and weird and deep experience. Okay, guys, that is it. That is the last chapter. We're done. See you at the test.